This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. I hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. Hello everybody. As always, before we get started, if you're enjoying the content here on the channel, be sure to like and subscribe. We are officially less than a week away from the end of 2016, and my goodness, has it been one of those years, right? Later on this week, either for Thursday's live talk or possibly a Critical Thought, we'll kind of do a year wrap-up, I believe. But we still got time. If you haven't been checking out yet, I've been counting down my top 10 favorite games of 2016 over on GameWisdom.com. And I'll be doing more of a cross-post of a complete collection of that once it's over, probably next week, just in time for 2017. But for today, today's Critical Thought is going to be on what we were talking about yesterday, and that is the importance of playtesting. Now, for those of you watching this who are established developers, what we're going to talk about you've probably already figured out. And if you're a consumer, you probably don't care about this either. But if you're a student interested in making games, or a first-time or growing developer, this is something you really need to understand. And the use and functionality of playtesting has certainly changed over the last few years. But let's start with at the beginning. When we talk about testing games or playtesting, we're referring to having people come in to look at your game. Sometimes this would be during the alpha period of the game, when it's still being fully developed, systems are being established, or during the beta, when a game is usually mostly done and we're now at the point of refinement and fine-tuning. One of my, or I should say at this moment, my only real video game related job was doing beta testing for Shrapnel Games back in the day. And that was kind of my first exposure to the game development side of the industry. Now, when it comes to testing games, there are two broad categories that are usually looked at. The first is from a programming or back-end kind of thing. This is when we're talking about bug squashing. This is probably the most unluxurious part of the game development side, but this is how you have to find all those annoying bugs that can crash a game, cause things not to work, and so on. This is where you have things like we need to test every weapon and every weapon effect in the game to make sure that everything works. There's no breaks in the animation. Nothing will destroy the skeletal frame of an enemy. Or is all the code working for every modifier in the game? And we're talking about modifiers like in Diablo, fire, ice, whatever. We could sit here and name it. Or even more esoteric stuff like, if I jump on this platform and use this gun at this specific time, does it crash the game? Does the game have memory links? Are there performance issues? All kinds of crazy stuff. And this is one of the toughest parts of getting a game polished and refined, because for every bug you squash, chances are there's a few dozen more you've probably missed somewhere. And this is why I can never get upset with games when there's bugs in them, because I know how much work it is to do all that. And this is a major part of why early access has become popular, but we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. Now, the other side of testing comes more in the refinement and polish side. This is when we talk about, does this game play right? Do the controls feel responsive? Does this UI make sense? These are parts that it takes a lot of people to look at, and where the main focus of getting these fresh eyes on your game comes into play. Because as a developer, one of the issues that we've seen, what has affected just about everyone, is when you've spent the last 6 months, year plus working on a game, it tends to put you on blinders mode, tunnel vision. It's very hard to see things from the outside perspective when you've built the whole damn thing by yourself or with a small group. And being able to have people come in and look at your game and give that fresh take is invaluable. When it comes to this kind of testing and such, the big part of this has to be at the start is usually a closed beta or a closed testing. This is when developers look at, friends, family, local people to look at your game. And this is great and all, but it's very important to get as many people looking at your game as possible. And this is all the more so when we're talking about very niche or very complicated genres. For instance, whenever a new fighting game comes out, chances are that developer has reached out to the major players on the scene to get their take on it. I think it was announced when Street Fighter V was entering early beta that a lot of the high-level players at EVO got first crack at it. And we can bet that the latest MMOs will have it, MOBAs, strategy games, etc. Now, when it comes to this kind of testing, again, as a developer, you need to get as many people looking at it as possible. And in the early days, this was considered pretty much a position. You could pay people either in terms of getting the game for free or like an hourly rate depending upon the studio and such. But as we know, things have certainly transitioned away from that. And that takes us to the other major point for today, early access. Love it or hate it, early access has become a very integral part of game development, especially for indie developers. Now, on the off chance that you're watching this and you don't know what early access is of course the program that allows you to sell an unfinished game on Steam and continue working on it for the duration of your development. You could put a game on there that is literally, 0.0001 in terms of alpha, or you have a game that is literally a month away and you can have it up for there. And for the consumer, this allows them to get a game early, usually at a discounted price. But as we know, there are some obvious exceptions to that, like Prison Architect. But through early access, it gives the developer essentially putting their consumers in the same field as their beta testers. You can get a whole lot of people to examine your game and comb over every inch of it to see what works, what doesn't, and of course find all those nasty bugs we mentioned before. And for small-time developers, this is worth its weight in gold times 100. When I spoke with Tim Keenan from Misfits Attic, who did the game Duskers, he talked about how his beta testers or his early access community were able to find bugs that he would have never have discovered until, way after launch when it's being criticized and marking the game down for it. And this is why having hardcore players look at your game is such an invaluable tool. As we mentioned, I think in an earlier critical thought, I think it was about esports, competitive players are some of the most analytical consumers out there. They have to be. They're the ones who are playing this game professionally. And that means they will come over every inch, every animation, every frame, every special move to figure out what works, what doesn't, and the best way to play. And for a developer who's trying to get their game as polished and as refined as possible, that kind of feedback is so important. And again, you're not going to get that by yourself or even with your small crew of people. Again, as a developer, you're not going to have the time to test every frame of animation, every line of code while you're still building the game and still working with your engine. And having 500, 1,000, 5,000 people looking at your game and, again, scrutinizing every detail will ultimately make it better. Now, when it comes to early access, again, there is a grayer topic. I think we talked about this before on the subject of when do you go on early access? Do you wait until your game is 70% done? Do you wait until you have literally your first alpha and put it on? And again, that is a topic that in of itself we could probably spend a critical thought on if I haven't already covered it. And like I said, with these critical thoughts, I put out so many it's sometimes easy to forget what has already been covered. But when it comes to when you're going on or when you're going to do testing, this is another major part of game development. The earlier it is in a game's design or when you're building the game, the easier it is to make major changes. One of the biggest signs that there's trouble with the game is if we're talking a game that's like 70, 80% done, we're in beta, it's going to be out in 2 months, and then the developer just does a complete 180 and changes grand systems, changes an engine, as a big example could be talked about right now. But the point is, the further along you are into a game's design, it becomes harder and harder to make these corrections or changes. As we've talked about with this concept of harmonizing game design, great games are built on everything working in sync. One system will affect another, which will affect another, and so on. When you make a grand change, especially to your core gameplay loop or system, it's going to reverberate out and affect every part of it. And this is where the idea of, basically scrapping work, falling backwards, going 10 steps back come into play. And one of the surefire ways to kill a game's design is making multiple grand changes as you're getting near the end. Because then you have to rebuild things over again. But let's say you want to make another change, so we have to rebuild it again, and so on. And again, we start talking about that, we'll be here for another 15 minutes. So let's get back to testing. So with early access, like we said, it has become somewhat controversial, especially in terms of the quality of the game. But as a developer, you need eyes on your game, and this is the major point for today's critical thought. If you are designing a game, you want as many people to look at it as you can. When I talked with Charles from Jara Technologies, who did Concealed Intent, he also talked about how vital it was to have these people looking at your game. And even if you don't go on early access, it's still important to have private beta testing or private alpha as well. Now, when you go to a public, that leads into some very interesting discussions, because at this point you're basically having a pseudo early access in a sense. Even though the idea of a paid beta test or a public beta test has been used before early access has came along. But again, the more people you have to look at your game, ultimately the better it's going to turn out. Now, with that said, this can lead into another topic, but it's important to mention here, and that is on the subject of taking feedback and criticism. As a game developer, you need to be both completely open to topics, but also know when to shut it down. Because at the end of the day, when you're dealing with your fans, game design is very much a dictatorship. You or your team are the people in charge. And ultimately, it's going to be up to you and your group to figure out the direction of this game. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you should just completely block out all criticism and comments. But you need to understand what your game is going to be about, what your foundation is, and you have to stick to that. If you have to do a grand change like that, you really need to think it through. And when it comes to listening to your testers, to your fans, it's important to understand, or it's important to take every bit of criticism, even if it is something that makes no sense. There's too much red in your game and it hurts my eyes. Or, this character jumps and it feels weird. And it's important to always analyze all the criticism and all the comments coming in. If one person says your game is too hard out of 15, it's important, but you can always chalk it up to maybe that person's a less experienced player. If 300 of 500 people say your game is too hard, then you may want to take a note on that. And this goes back to, again, the fact that the more people looking at your game, the more data you can analyze and go over. And again, if a lot of people are saying similar comments, even if it's not completely related, this can lead to a decision or a way of altering your game to ultimately make it better. A good example, or a somewhat of an example, would be if you have people complaining about different parts of difficulty. Let's say someone says that this weapon is too weak, and then you have a lot of people saying, let's say one weapon is just too damn strong. You can infer then that you have an imbalance with your weapons. If person gets weapon A, it's going to make the game harder than it should be. But if they get weapon B, then the game's going to become a cakewalk. And again, this kind of discussion is way too big for today, and we can easily come back to it in any number of fields. But again, you have to be able to analyze what people are saying. Like I said, ultimately, the decision about where the game goes is going to be up to you. But you need to be able to take in all this information and realize, what does this mean regarding how people view your game? Because if everyone who plays your game says they hate it, chances are it's not going to do well in the market. But with that said, for our final point, it's very important to mention this. Just because you have a successful early access doesn't guarantee your game is going to be amazing, get 10 out of 10 reviews, everybody loves it. Early access, just like with beta testing or alpha testing, is still a closed environment. There are a lot of people who will not look at a game in early access because they don't want to play something that's unfinished, and that is a very fair statement. But what that means is, just because people are all loving your game that's early access doesn't guarantee success. But a successful early access can generally help mitigate, again, the risks and the uncertainty of when your game goes to 1.0 and is released. And of course, when you make that transition from beta to retail, that's easily another topic, especially if we're talking early access. But let's wrap things up for today. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying the content, be sure to like and subscribe and all that great stuff. Check back tomorrow for more content here, as well as on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. I am still Josh Bycer. Have a great rest of the night. Hope you're enjoying the holidays, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Take care. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.